Cheap knives! Yay! All of these knives I have on the table are Ozark Trails, and more or less they're all about $5 each. That's what you're looking at right here. Now, the word cheap in the knife slash EDC slash gear slash whatever you want to call it community is typically a bad one. It's a bad word. When you hear the word cheap, usually the first thing that enters your mind is the word crap. And sometimes that's true. Yes, there are cheap knives out there that are crap. But the funny thing is there are plenty of expensive knives out there that are crap. Now, we have to back up here and define what this really means. What does crap mean? What does cheap mean? How can an expensive knife be crap? It's all subjective and it requires context, I say. It depends on how much you're spending and what the quality of the knife is in comparison to that price tag. That's where the whole cheap, bad, crap, all those negative words really come into play and really actually have a meaning. If you were to compare this Spyderco Manix FRCP directly to this Ozark Trail. I don't even think this one has a model number or name at all. It was part of the whole 6-piece combo set that was $15, which came with this knife as well as this knife. You could argue this knife's probably worth either $5, maybe even $4 if you were to put it in that context. This guy, they no longer make this model anymore exactly with the CTS BD1 and steel, but at the time it was more or less maybe $90 to $100. Although they look very different, and the biggest difference between the two is just going to be the blade steel. Other than that, they're actually pretty similar in a lot of ways. We have a shaft lock on this guy, cage ball bearing lock right here. However, their external functionality is almost exactly the same. You just pull back on it to release it on that guy right there. And then exact same thing on the cage ball bearing lock, pull back on it to release it. Very similar operation, even though they're technically different locking mechanisms. More or less, they're pretty close as far as their functionality is concerned. They both have stonewash finishes, despite our cheaper knife that's worth about $5 on the right being smaller than the Manix. The cutting edge is actually a little bit longer, I think. Just very, very close. If anything, it's exactly the same, but I think it's slightly longer. Handle materials are different. This is FRCP. This guy's some random polymer. They're both tip-up carry, although unfortunately our Ozark Trails is not swappable to the left side. But overall, this guy right here is about $90 to $95 more than this guy is, if you're talking about when these were available, this exact model anyway. So theoretically, you could purchase 20 of these before getting one of these. Really, our only advantage, other than just preference and ergonomics, aesthetics, etc., is just the blade steel. We have CTS BD1 on the Spyderco, and then we have either 3CR13 or 440A, some softer blade steel on the Ozark Trail. Other than that, aside from aesthetics and ergonomics, they're pretty comparable knives, actually, despite them looking and seeming like completely different folders from far away. At the end of the day, if you were to carry this guy, open it up, cut something with it, put it away, and do the same thing with this guy, the Spyderco. Pull it out of your pocket, open it up, make a cut, open a letter, cut a zip tie, or open some kind of package, tape. You're probably not really going to notice a night and day difference, despite them being different levels of quality, despite the blade steel. No competition. Obviously, the CTS BD1 steel is going to be better than whatever this one is. Is it worth $90 to $95 more? That's where the argument for me begins. If you're just directly comparing those two and you're not talking about price, obviously the Spyderco is better. But when we throw those price tags in, that's pretty polarizing, how you can get nearly 20 of these before one of those Spydercos. Granted, the Spyderco's made in the US, this guy's made in China. But just face value, just talking about the price tags and the functionality behind those price tags, it's kind of hard for me to just say, no, you have to get that Spyderco Manix instead of this Ozark Trail right here. You have to. You have to get it. This is crap. That Spyderco's great. I would not call this knife crap unless you spent $100 on it. Then yeah, it's a piece of shit. But for $5, hell, $4, I don't know. This is actually one of the best $4 to $5 knives I've ever had. The shaft lock right here, it's actually very smooth. They're both on standard washers. Neither of them even have ball bearings. They feel about as smooth at each other. It has a great lockup, no side to side, no up and down. Ergonomics are not too bad. It feels very similar to a Benchmade Griptilian. And directly comparing this to a Benchmade Griptilian, the exact same argument pretty much comes into play. Other than the blade steel, everything else is almost spot on. It's very, very similar. Even the fit and finish. I don't have a Griptilian on me right now, but I used to have a handful of them back in the day. Again, around the $100 range or so. It's been a while since I've looked at them recently, but the exact same argument comes into play. This rule does not just apply to knives, but pretty much every other product I know of in existence. The law of diminishing returns. If everything operated on a linear curve, let's say you spend $5 on a knife, you get X amount of quality. You spend $10 on a knife, which is twice as much, you should get twice the quality. Meaning if you spend $20 a knife, you should be getting 4 times the quality of a $5 knife, right? By that logic, a knife that's $100 in comparison to a $5 knife should be 20 times better than the $5 knife. But I argue that's not necessarily the case. These do not operate on a linear curve. At a certain point, it starts tapering off and off. Imagine the curve of price to quality and functionality ratio dipping the higher that price tag gets. Yes, the more expensive knives are going to be better than the cheaper knives, generally, but is it literally equal to how much you spent? Not necessarily in my experience. Again, going back to the Spyderco right here, better knife than any of these on the table easily, but is it 20 times better? That's kind of tricky to talk about. I mean, the blade steel, the cutting edge is going to last a lot longer. You'll have to resharpen it less. It may rust up on you not as readily, but it's about as smooth as any of these knives. The lockup's as good, pretty much. I mean, yeah, there's more jimping on this knife, and I like the Volcano grip, but this grip does not cost that much to make. It's a wire clip. That's pretty cheap. Probably costs about the same as the pocket clip right there, more or less. Locking mechanisms, although they're not the same, they operate very similarly. The lockups are about as good as each other. $95 more. Although the Manix is better, I'm not going to say it's 20 times better than any of these knives. It's kind of a trickier comparison. This is what applies to knives, and you get into the $200 knives, the $300, $4, $5, $6. Eventually, you start getting into like space age timings and tolerances, and ooh, the anodization on the titanium's a certain grade, and it's really high quality, and it's really expensive to produce, and blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, functionally speaking, is that $500 knife going to offer you that much more utility than any of the $5 knives you're looking at right here? I would answer with a resounding no. Hell no, actually. Yeah, obviously the $500, $600 knife's going to be better than any of these, miles above it. But if you're spending 100 times more money, do you actually think you're going to be getting 100 times more performance? No. You're going to get better performance. It might be like 10 times more, 12, 15 times maybe tops, but I guarantee you it's not literally going to be dollar for dollar improvement. That's just how all products work, not just knives, cars, TVs, computers, phones, everything. Everything operates that way. Kitchen equipment, appliances. The expensive ones typically are better than the ones that are cheaper beneath them, but at a certain point, the output does not become as equal to the input, by which I mean the cost. At a certain point, you start getting less in comparison to what you're paying for. So this brings me to the cheap knives we have right here. These are all very, very cheap as far as their price tags are concerned, but I'm going to say as far as their quality goes, extremely high value, through the roof value on these Ozark trails. You get a Benchmade for $100, $150, $200, $350, and yeah, you'll get a nicer blade steel that'll last a lot longer, and the tolerances, the fit and finish will be a little bit nicer, but at the end of the day, they often still just use polymer handles, or maybe G10. It's going to be a little bit nicer. They're still going to have stainless steel pocket clips. They're going to use slightly better heat-treated hardware. And yeah, easily you'll be able to cut more stuff with those blade steels before you have to resharpen them. These you're going to have to resharpen a lot more often. But even then, you're not going to have to spend as much time resharpening them. That's just how softer blade steels work. That's a whole nother thing, comparing the cheaper steels to the more expensive steels. Yeah, the more expensive steels, you're not going to have to resharpen them as often, but when you do, you're going to have to spend a hell of a lot more time resharpening them because they're harder. That's just how metal works. Back in the day, the $10 knives, $15 knives, like sub $20 folders were crap. By which I mean, they fell apart on you. The hardware, the screws would literally start unscrewing themselves out. Not just the pivot screw, but like the body screws. If you tried to tighten them, they would just strip super easily. They usually have horrendous lockups, just tons and tons of blade play side to side, up and down. If you tried adjusting it, again, either it would be stuck, it wouldn't move at all, or maybe the pivot screw would rotate the other side. And even then, the pivot screws often, the heads would strip or the threading would strip. The blades would not be very sharp, and even after you do resharpen them, they dull on you really quickly. So they take a long time to sharpen, and they wouldn't get that sharp. And even when they do get that sharp, they lose their edge pretty quickly. That's what I consider crap. That would be bad quality. And back in the day, I want to say even like a decade ago, especially 20 years ago, yeah, knives that were like below the $15, $20 range usually were crap. It didn't make sense to buy them. It made more sense just to save up at least 25, even 30 to get something much higher value. These days, these Ozark trails are around the $5 range, literally $5 for this guy as well as this guy as of super light 2023 as I'm filming this right now. Some of the most amazing high value folders I've ever had for $5 each. $10 for the pair right here, less than 12 including the tax, something like that. That's actually insane. We get these shaft locks right here. They're kind of the Benchmade Axis lock copies. Yeah, they got kind of shitty blade steels, but you're not spending that much. They get really sharp. And when we're talking EDC, we usually don't use our knives all that much. Most of us anyway. Most of the time we just carry it. Occasionally something comes up, we have to cut, and we do the 1 or 2 cuts, and we put the knife away, and we don't cut anything with it for a while. Not a big deal. Do we need really high quality blade steels that'll last months without needing to be resharpened? Most of us don't. There are specific situations and scenarios out there, understood, but generally speaking, most of us don't need $200, $300, $400 folding knives. Don't get me wrong, they're sexy and all, they're sweet, but when we're talking dollar to dollar value, at a certain point, you do not get what you are putting into it. Again, prices and knives in particular absolutely do not operate on a linear curve. At a certain point, it starts tapering off, and then once you get into the hundreds, it almost flatlines, it plateaus. That 1% better material or that 1% nicer anodization or better fit and finish, you start spending more and more money just for these almost unnoticeable improvements. I like cheap knives if they're well made for the money. I do not like a quote-unquote cheap knife if it will fall apart and have bad hardware, horrendous blade steel, bad heat treatment, bad fit and finish, bad design, bad ergonomics, bad lockup. No, I don't like knives like that either. Nobody does. But if you can give me a high value folder, we're talking value in comparison to how much you're spending, you're getting a lot of value, a lot of quality for any of these knives you're seeing on the table right here. Again, for around the $5 range. You're actually getting an insane amount of value here. Defense knives, hell yeah, why not? I always recommend cheap knives for defense. I don't think they're better than the expensive knives for defense, but what I mean is I think they'll work just as well. You get that blade nice and sharp, just keep it sharp, keep it on you for defense, and if that dark and rainy day ever came and you had to make 1 or 2 cuts against somebody who was trying to kill you, trying to kill someone else, and you had to use your knife to save your life or somebody else's life lawfully, a cheap knife will do probably about as well as a much more expensive knife will, as long as it's got a decent lockup, which all of these do. Whether it's a liner lock or a shaft lock, they all have pretty good lockups, actually. This one's okay, it's not great, but the rest of them are pretty much rock solid. In fact, I've had $90 folders that had some blade slop and not great lockups either. So bottom line, if you get a decent quality knife, even if it's cheap, as in $5 or so, I consider that to be cheap. You get it sharp and you make your 1 or 2 cuts, it's probably gonna work just fine for you, my guy. You don't need a super blade steel that'll last you years before you have to resharpen it, because guess what? In most defensive situations, it's a couple passes or even 1 thrust or 1 swipe. The cutting edge, just because it's cheap, is not suddenly going to go from razor sharp to butter knife in a couple of cuts. That's just not going to happen. So for defense, I have nothing against cheap knives. Another thing I like about cheap knives is that most of us don't baby them. When we buy a knife that's $200-300 or so, we don't want to get it scratched, so we don't use it. What's the point? At that point, it's kind of like you're just buying artwork or you're buying something that you think is cool. And hey, more power to you. If that makes you happy, awesome. I think expensive knives are really sweet. They're really cool. For actual use, I'm more likely going to use something like one of these on the table right here. something that's about $5. I'm not going to worry about any of these getting scratched. I'm not going to worry about using these to cut up things that are gunky and dirty and shitty and grimy. I'm just not really going to care. I don't feel as bad about getting any of these degraded or gunked up one way or another. I will use these things. Hell yeah, why not? I won't worry too much about losing any of these things. If I bring it on a camping trip where I'm going out, would you bring a $300 knife with you? Maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't. On a fishing trip out on a boat, waves are going and you're trying to cut something on the line, maybe something got caught. Would you pull out that $400 knife to cut the line in the middle of the ocean? If that drops in the water, you're never seeing that thing again. Would you do it? Maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't. Would you do it with one of these? Probably. You can stash cheap knives around in oddball places. You won't worry too much about these getting rusted, about these getting scratched up, and at the end of the day, they'll probably work about as well as the much more expensive knives will. Bottom line, as long as they're decent quality, I have absolutely nothing against cheap knives or what I would consider to be high value knives. You could spend a lot more on something better, but is it worth the extra couple $100? Is it that much better? If you're getting 20% more performance, but you're spending 300% of the price, that's when I have trouble caring to spend my money on something like that. Just me. What do you think about the cheaper or more affordable or more budget-friendly folders? Do you like them? Do you use them? Or do you think they're just junk and you absolutely must get something more expensive? Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching. Feel free to subscribe, hit that little bell notification if you do not want to miss weekly knife and gun videos of all sorts, and feel free to support me on Patreon, link in the description. Thank you so much for watching. Mannix out.